There is a rule people tell themselves about evil. Extraordinary horrors require monstrous personalities, madmen, sadists, monsters cut off from ordinary life. That rule comforts you. It lets you believe crimes of state are the work of aberrations, not the product of ordinary competence turned obedient. For decades, historians and journalists accepted a corollary. If a technocrat keeps his head and avoids the rhetoric, he is not a monster. He is a functionary. He did his job. He kept production moving. He did what was necessary in wartime. That rule stood firm in minds across post-war Europe and America. It made it possible to separate the architects of mass murder into two camps, the ideologues who shouted and the managers who delivered. But in 1945, one man's life would smash that neat distinction. In the ruin of the Reich, a minister who wore a pince-nez and spoke as a civilized man would force the world to ask a terrible question. What happens when skill, organization, and ambition are used to make mass death efficient? That question exploded the comforting rule. And it begins with a name, Albert Speer. You imagine a slim young architect in Berlin, 1933. He is 37 years old, trained at the Technical University, sharply ambitious, polite in manner, furious in private ambition. He admires order. He projects monuments. He loves symmetry and stone. His art brings him into the party. He designs pageantry, the Nuremberg rally grounds, huge platforms and grandstands built to make one man appear eternal. Adolf Hitler sees Speer's plans. He likes the way Speer frames spectacle. He likes the man's smoothness. He adopts him. Between 1933 and 1942, Speer becomes indispensable, not simply for buildings but for organization. He is Hitler's architect, his confidant, his favorite son, a man who can translate a dictator's fantasies into concrete schedules, budgets, and steel. In February 1942, the Reich faces a logistical nightmare. The invasion of the Soviet Union is grinding on. Tanks, guns, aircraft, all are consumed in vast numbers. Labor is fleeing the cities, the Allies are bombing, German men are dying at the front. Hitler needs output. He needs weapons. War depends on production. Hitler appoints Albert Speer as Minister of Armaments and War Production. The appointment is simple. You give the technocrat the problem, he gives you solutions. But there is one crucial variable every technocrat hates to confront: people. Speer inherits millions of workers. By 1942, Germany's labor pool has shrunk by tens of millions, and the minister faces a stark statistic. The Reich is short of manpower equivalent to several million workers, men who are now dead, wounded, or serving abroad. What does Speer do? He solves the equation with what he thinks are rational moves. He rationalizes industry. He centralizes factories. He optimizes production lines. He raises output per worker. He solves the math. But to make the numbers add, he accepts another resource, one with no human dignity and no legal rights under Nazi rule: slave labor. What follows is an industrial solution that looks like engineering on paper and looks like atrocity in reality. You now stand at the margin between technical genius and moral catastrophe. You are listening to the Daily Brief in 1942. The sound is the scratch of pencil on ledger paper, the clack of typewriters, the low murmur of officials. Speer sits with a stack of tables: aircraft produced per month, tank chassis completed per week, shell casings per shift. The bombings have hit ball-bearing plants in Essen and oil refineries in Ploiești. The Allies hope that enough destruction will collapse the German war effort. Speer orders time and time again: decentralize production, standardize components, increase output per worker. He issues a memo: wherever possible, transfer production underground; wherever possible, economize input; wherever possible, mobilize additional labor. The memo reads like an engineer's to-do list. Its consequence is a human inventory. Trains begin moving people like freight. You track one route: a convoy leaving Krakow on a winter day in 1944 carrying 3,200 civilian workers bound for forced labor at a synthetic fuel plant. You feel the vibration as the freight cars cross the rails. You note the manifest: numbers instead of names. You hear guards barking, the cough of those already exhausted. Men and women arrive already weakened. They step into barracks and into a line system that measures output per hour. At Mittelwerk in the Harz Mountains, you can feel the two realities collide. The engineers have carved tunnels that run miles underground to protect rocket production from bombing. The production target is set in numbers: 300 V2 rockets per month, a figure that will never be purely technical because it requires human bodies to meet it. Prisoners from satellite camps are marched into the underground galleries. Their hands learn the sequence of tasks: rivet, bolt, inspect. They work under the watch of SS supervisors. They sweat, breathe oil dust, and sleep in narrow bunks. Their food is meager and caloric intake does not meet the strain. The mortality rate is high, tens of thousands over months. Speer signs memos approving the physical layout, the shift schedules, the allocation of materials, the technical salaries and allowances for foremen. He receives reports that list absentee percentages and disease incidents. Absentee rate, 27% this month due to illness. He asks for replacement timelines. A military man in the room says, replacement convoys will arrive in 2 weeks by rail if transport is available. Speer notes time to replacement and returns to optimization. Technical rationalization hardens into moral numbness. You pause and ask, at what point does calculation become complicity? You feel that point as a physical pressure behind the eyes in the cold subterranean galleries where the rockets are assembled and the men die one by one. Now imagine the Allied strategic bombing, the background percussion, and Speer's reaction. Factories burn. He moves production underground. He moves machine tools into caverns. He moves people. He orders the concealment of kill lists under production schedules. He measures success in throughput. More aircraft, more shells, more tanks per month. The numbers climb. The battlefield costs of those numbers are paid in blood. By the winter of 1943-44, his measures show results in metrics. Fighter production increases by X%, tank output rises from a baseline to a new figure. The precise percentages would be argued over by historians for decades, but the pattern is clear. Speer's approach prolongs the Reich's capacity to fight. Then the war tilts and the front pressures culminate in collapse. On April 30, 1945, Adolf Hitler dies in Berlin. The Reich dissolves. Speer retreats with other ministers to the north. He is not a brigand with a suitcase of loot. He is a man with documents, records, codes, safe combinations, and with knowledge that is valuable to new masters. He plans escape routes. He considers hiding, camouflage, legal covers. But he is captured. The capture is an action sequence in present tense. On May 23, 1945, British troops move into Flensburg and the surrounding area. You watch Speer's arrest unfold in real time. He sits in a modest room. The door opens. Soldiers step inside. They read his identification. He is handcuffed. They march him to a jeep. He climbs in, shoulders tense, eyes trained to calculate. He is taken to an internment facility. His papers are seized. The world of calculated production abruptly becomes the world of interrogation. From the moment the Americans learn he is available, two imperatives collide. One is justice, prosecutors seeking to bring Nazi leaders to account. The other is utility, officers and civil servants eager to learn how German armaments survive strategic bombing so they can plan the future. Paul Nitze, later a key Cold War strategist, is not yet the man he will become, but he is tasked with an urgent problem: how to make sense of German industrial resilience. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey (USSBS) sends investigators to obtain Speer's knowledge. You sit in the room where the interrogation takes place. The sound is pen on paper. Paul Nitze speaks in clipped, deliberate phrases. J.K. Galbraith scribbles notes. George Ball asks about procurement schedules. Speer is calm. He explains, with the cool of a man who enjoys order, how he redistributed machine tools, how he standardized parts, how he moved shop floors underground, how he centralized procurement and replaced inefficient agencies. He gives them keys to safes. He reveals the location of archive boxes. He tells them which factories the V-2 rockets left from and how the raw materials supply chain functioned. He explains the logic of labor allocation and the policies that allowed millions of people to be conscripted into work battalions. The Americans listen, and the calculus in their heads is immediate: intelligence high value. The temptation is obvious. You can imagine the internal debate: prosecute the man or extract the knowledge he holds first. The answer is not mysterious. They extract the knowledge. For 10 days, a concentrated, almost surgical interrogation, he supplies details. He speaks in specifics: dates, factory codes, the number of shifts, the composition of work crews. In return, he receives interrogators who treat him as a source. They ask about how to defeat similar industrial resilience in a future war. He answers. Here a moment of moral ambiguity becomes a concrete decision with consequences. The Allies choose to prioritize knowledge over immediate retribution. The USSBS departs with Speer's cooperation, and Speer is left in Allied custody to face eventual charges at Nuremberg. At Nuremberg, the action is staged and theatrical and legal. The indictment is read on November 20, 1945. The charges are monumental: conspiracy to wage aggressive war, war crimes, crimes against humanity. The world watches as film of gas chambers and heaps of corpses is shown in court. You feel the collective recoil, the room convulses in moral outrage, and you hear the prosecutor's voice listing facts and catalogs, the film projected in stark frames. On June 21, 1946, Speer rises to testify. Present tense now he speaks. He chooses a strategy that will be pivotal. He admits responsibility for armaments policy, expresses remorse in long, measured sentences, and denies intimate knowledge of the final solution. He positions himself as a technocrat who did not know who should have known, but who did not participate in extermination planning. The courtroom is tense. The prosecutor presses with documentary evidence: minutes of meetings, labor allocation orders, shipments to factories adjacent to camps. Witnesses describe conditions in satellite camps that supplied labor to Speer's factories. The tribunal hears the testimonies of those who survived forced labor. Their voices ragged with cold and exhaustion, their numbers often reduced to how many worked on a shift rather than names. Speer's defense is a rhetorical and moral pivot: confession plus mitigation. He will say repeatedly and with precision, "I accept moral responsibility." He will avoid the word guilty in the fullest sense, claim ignorance of the extermination procedure, and paint himself as a servant of efficiency who was naive about the most criminal policies. The tribunal deliberates. On October 1, 1946, the judgment is pronounced. Albert Speer is sentenced to 20 years imprisonment. The sentence is less than death, less than life, and creates an immediate debate. Some call it lenient. The Soviet judges object. Western observers argue about whether his cooperation justified the lesser penalty. You sense the resonant moral question. Did a man who engineered the engine of oppression avoid full accountability because he offered information the victors wanted? Inside prison, Spandau, Speer becomes a model prisoner. He reads, he tends a small garden, and he writes. He crafts a narrative of reflection. He will use those years to compose a memoir destined to reshape public perception. His book Inside the Third Reich will present him as a repentant technocrat, as a man who failed to see the worst, as a figure with a mind for architecture and a heart that later matured into remorse. But the action does not end there. Decades later, archival revelations and correspondence show that his knowledge was deeper and his involvement more complicit than he publicly admitted. Letters and documents, some released in the early 21st century, suggest that his assistants toured Auschwitz and reported back details. A letter reveals he attended a meeting at Posen in October 1943, where Heinrich Himmler spoke in plain terms about the extermination of the Jews. Speer later claims he left before the critical speech. Historians will wrestle over whether that is truth, evasion, or deceit. One critical moment of suspense must stand out: the moment when Speer, at Nuremberg or in private correspondence, hints he might have known more than he allowed. For a time, the public narrative accepts the good Nazi account because it offers closure. A man who did wrong but then repented. When the later evidence appears, the good Nazi myth collapses again, exposing the shape of culpability. This is the failure moment where the rule you relied on earlier, that the technocrat is harmless, is proven false. Speer's calm competence is not an extenuating feature. It is the tool by which a genocidal regime scaled its crimes. The courtroom drama and the post-war memoirs cannot erase the fact that production continued, and the production required bodies. What he did, and what the Allies did in response, reverberated. First ripple, military consequence. Speer's organizational changes increased output of tanks, aircraft, and munitions at crucial points in 1943-44. Those extra weapons did not change history's arc, but they prolonged fights, increased casualties, and compelled Allied commanders to commit additional forces. The efficiency Speer engineered cost lives on battlefields from Normandy to the Eastern Front. Second ripple, industrial normalization of atrocity. Because production became routinized, the machinery of persecution could be embedded in ordinary offices, procurement departments, scheduling meetings, railway manifests. The language of numbers allowed mass murder to be administered by men who wore suits rather than uniforms. It meant that genocide could be operationalized, scheduled, and accounted for in ledger form. That normalization is one of the darkest legacies. The idea that atrocities can be treated as production problems. Third ripple, legal and moral precedent. Nuremberg pronounces crimes against humanity, a doctrine that will inform international law for decades. Yet the Speer case introduces a troubling exception: the possibility that cooperation and technical usefulness reduce culpability. The legal community debates the limits of command responsibility and how to weigh confession plus cooperation against documented complicity. Fourth ripple, Cold War politics. The Americans who interrogated Speer, and the institutions that absorbed his testimony, used his insights to shape post-war strategy. Paul Nitze and others later advise on strategic planning shaped in part by lessons drawn from the Reich's industrial resiliency. That knowledge shapes policies in a bifurcated world where future conflicts might require different doctrines. Pragmatism here collides with justice. The imperative to prevent future wars competes with the imperative to punish past crimes. Fifth ripple, cultural memory. Speer's memoir Inside the Third Reich becomes a bestseller. Its effect is immediate and long-lasting. It manufactures a narrative where guilt is smoothed into nostalgia and repentance. The good Nazi trope infiltrates films, biographies, and public debates. For a generation, Speer's portrait serves as a talking point. Not all who served were monsters. But as archives open, later scholars expose the gaps, and the public narrative must be corrected. What they did not know at the time, what public opinion resisted, was the depth of administrative involvement in mass murder. Many institutions preferred a simpler narrative. The speed with which former officials reintegrated into Western economic and political life, sometimes as consultants, sometimes as writers, sometimes as businessmen, further complicated collective memory. Return to the human scale. You will recall concrete numbers. Approximately 12 million people were used as forced labor in the Nazi economy, an estimate that includes civilian conscripts and prisoners of war. Of these, roughly 3 million were POWs, and between 7 and 9 million were civilian forced laborers taken from occupied territories. At the Mittelwerk complex and its satellite camps, historians estimate around 20,000 deaths among prisoners involved in V2 production, figures that vary but convey scale. You remember the man, Albert Speer, born March 19, 1905, appointed February 8, 1942, arrested May 23, 1945, indicted November 20, 1945, testified June 21, 1946, sentenced October 1, 1946, released September 30, 1966, and died September 1, 1981. Those dates mark a life that moved from architect to armaments minister to prisoner to best-selling author. You remember names of survivors whose labor sustained those production lines? Nameless, mostly in the official documents. Their towns were emptied of fathers and daughters, fields abandoned, communities broken. They left behind ghost villages and decades of silence that historians have slowly filled with testimony. The lists of shipments, the registry books, the guard rosters, the death tallies. You consider Speer after prison. He writes Inside the Third Reich and shapes a narrative sold to millions. He is praised by some journalists and interrogated by others. He tours, he speaks, he is received by television studios and academic panels. He calls himself repentant. He pleads moral responsibility. He becomes, disturbingly, a symbol of rehabilitation. Later archival evidence, letters published in the early 21st century and research that emerges in waves, shows that the story is more complex. His assistants visited Auschwitz. He corresponded with Himmler. He knew about the expansion of camps for labor purposes and, according to some documents and testimony, knew of the extermination machinery more than he publicly admitted. That belated evidence forces you to revise the rule you began with. Evil does not always wear flags and shout. It can sit behind desks, sign requisitions, and rationalize suffering. It can be polite and punctual. It can use architecture to make ideology look permanent and bureaucratic competence to ensure genocide is deliverable. Why does this matter now? Because the Speer case is not merely a historical curiosity. It is a template for the ethics of professionals who serve bad regimes. Engineers, planners, procurement officers, bureaucrats, their work can be ethically fraught. When systems prioritize output over dignity, when people become labor units in memos, when efficiency metrics trump human lives, the risk of atrocity grows. If this story moved you, please hit that like button. Every click tells the algorithm that this piece of history is worth preserving. We are dedicated to rescuing these forgotten and uncomfortable stories from dusty archives every single day. If you want to join us on this mission, please subscribe and turn on notifications. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment with your city or state, and tell us if someone in your family served or if your community remembers wartime industries. Your comment is part of keeping memory active and honest. Thank you for ensuring that Albert Speer, and the millions of forced laborers whose lives made his metrics possible, do not disappear into silence. They deserve to be remembered.